The blizzard that hit Madrid that January night was the worst in 50 years. Carmen Ruiz, 26 years old, waitress at a small restaurant in Vallecas, was closing up when she saw her, an elderly woman, maybe 80, sitting on an ice-cold bench across from the restaurant, shivering in a coat far too thin, with no gloves or scarf. Snow was piling up in her gray hair, on her wrinkled face, on her hunched shoulders. Carmen approached, and what the old woman whispered in a broken voice chilled her blood. "I have nowhere to go. My son won't answer his phone. Please, don't leave me here to freeze." Carmen, who lived in a 270-square-foot studio and barely made enough to survive, made the craziest, most right decision of her life. She took the old woman home. 24 hours later, a man in an Armani suit would knock on her door with a check that would change everything. But the real story, the one no one expected, was far deeper than anything money could buy. Madrid had transformed into a white, hostile expanse. The snow, which had started in the afternoon as innocent flurries, had become a fierce storm that paralyzed the city. Public transport was down, streets were impassable, temperatures had plunged to 5 degrees Fahrenheit -15 degrees Celsius. Authorities had issued red alerts, urging everyone to stay home. Carmen Ruiz had just finished the longest shift of her life at El Rinconcito, the neighborhood restaurant where she'd worked for 3 years. At 26, with a degree in literature but no prospects, she'd taken the waitressing job to pay the rent on her studio in Vallecas, one of Madrid's most humble neighborhoods. Her parents, farmers in Extremadura, were struggling too. She couldn't ask anyone for help. That night, there had been very few customers, just some brave souls who lived nearby. The owner, Mr. Garcia, had closed early and rushed home to Malasana. Carmen had stayed to clean, organize, and do inventory. It was almost 11 p.m. when she finally turned off the lights and stepped into the storm. The cold hit her like a slap. Snow stung her eyes and nose, freezing her eyelashes. Her thin coat, bought at a market 3 years ago, wasn't enough. Her worn-out boots filled with snow with every step. The nearest metro was a 20-minute walk away, and she didn't even know if it was running. It was while walking with her head down against the wind that she saw her. A dark figure on the bench across from the restaurant, covered in snow like a forgotten statue. At first she thought it was a pile of abandoned clothes. Then the figure moved slightly, and Carmen realized with horror that it was a person. She rushed over, slipping on the snow. It was an old woman, maybe 80, with a face wrinkled and marked by time and hardship. She wore a thin black coat completely inadequate for the killer cold, no gloves, no scarf, no hat. Snow had gathered in her gray hair, pulled into a messy bun, on her hunched shoulders, on the gnarled hands she clasped together in a desperate attempt to keep warm. Her eyes, when they lifted to meet Carmen's, were a faded blue but still lucid. There was dignity in those eyes, and shame, and a heartbreaking resignation. Her lips, violet from the cold, barely moved. The voice that came out was thin as a thread of ice, "I have nowhere to go." Carmen knelt before her, the snow immediately soaking her pants. She took the woman's hands, cold as marble. The old woman looked at the young face before her, and something broke inside. Tears began to fall, freezing almost instantly on her wrinkled cheeks. She explained in a broken voice that she had gone out that morning to do her shopping. She lived a few blocks away, but when she returned, she had found her apartment door sealed. "Eviction executed," the sign said. She hadn't paid rent in 6 months. Her son Javier, her only family, had promised to help but hadn't answered his phone in weeks. The neighbors had closed their doors when she knocked. Social services were closed because of the storm. She had no money for a hotel, no one to turn to. Carmen listened, her heart pounding. She knew that feeling of being alone in the world, with no one to lean on. After her degree, when she'd first come to Madrid full of dreams, she had spent nights crying in her rented room, wondering if she'd made the right choice, if she should have just stayed in Extremadura. But she had never been 80, never been homeless, never felt the deadly chill of night seeping into her bones. Looking at this woman, this grandmother who could have been her own, Carmen felt something shift inside her. A choice presented itself with crystal clarity. She could call someone, if she could even get a signal, and walk away with a clear conscience, saying she'd done what she could. Or she could do something crazy, reckless, and completely irresponsible by any logical standard. She made her decision in a heartbeat. She took off her scarf and wrapped it around the old woman's neck. She took off her gloves and put them on the frozen hands. Then, gently but firmly, she helped her stand. The woman was light as a feather. The years, and perhaps malnutrition, had worn her down. Carmen held her with an arm around her fragile waist. They didn't speak much as they slowly walked through the storm. Carmen didn't even know her name. The old woman leaned heavily on her, every step a struggle. The 20 minutes to Carmen's studio felt like hours. The wind howled, the snow was blinding, the cold bit deep, but Carmen kept walking, putting one foot in front of the other, holding this fragile life against her own. When they finally reached her building, a gray, dilapidated structure from the 70s, Carmen practically had to carry the woman up the stairs. The elevator hadn't worked for months. 3 floors, each step a mountain. On the 3rd floor, Carmen opened the door to her studio and guided the woman inside. The space was tiny, a single bed in one corner, a kitchenette that was little more than a hot plate and a mini fridge, a table with 2 chairs, a bathroom so small you could barely turn around. But it was warm. The heater worked, thank God, and for that night, it was a sanctuary. Carmen helped the woman sit in the only padded chair she owned. She removed her wet coat, worn-out shoes, and soaked socks, put a blanket over her shoulders, and boiled water for tea, the only thing she could offer, along with some dry cookies and a bit of bread. The old woman didn't speak. She was trembling violently, her teeth chattering. Carmen made the tea as hot as possible without burning her, with lots of sugar for the shock. She guided the cup to the woman's mouth. The old woman drank in small sips, eyes closed, tears still falling silently. After the tea, Carmen heated up some soup she had, the only decent thing in the house. The old woman ate slowly, every spoonful seeming to require effort. It was only later, when the color gradually returned to the woman's face and the trembling subsided, that they properly introduced themselves. The old woman's name was Rosa Lopez. She was 81 years old. She had been a widow for 15 years. Her husband had been a craftsman, a good man who had worked hard all his life. They'd had one son, Javier, who had moved abroad for work, or so he said. In reality, Rosa suspected her son was avoiding her, ashamed of her poverty and her age. In recent years, Rosa had lived on a small pension that barely covered rent and food. When she got sick the previous year, medical bills had devoured her savings. She had started skipping rent, hoping Javier would answer her calls, that he would come to her aid. But the calls went unanswered, and now she was here, homeless, saved by a stranger who owed her nothing. Carmen listened with a lump in her throat. Then she shared a little about herself. How she'd come to Madrid with dreams of becoming a writer or journalist, how reality had hit her hard, how she worked 60 hours a week to afford her tiny studio, how she felt alone too, far from family, with no real friends in the city. They talked late into the night, 2 lonely souls who had found each other in the storm. Then came bedtime. Carmen insisted Rosa take the bed. She would sleep in the chair with a blanket. Rosa protested, but Carmen was firm. She helped the old woman into bed, covered her with every blanket she had, even gave her favorite pillow. Rosa, settled into the narrow bed, looked up at the studio's cracked ceiling. Tears came again, but this time they weren't just from pain, they were from gratitude, from disbelief that so much kindness still existed in the world. Before falling asleep, she whispered something Carmen, curled up in the chair, barely heard, "God bless you, child." Carmen smiled in the dark. She didn't know it yet, but that night she had done much more than save a life. She had set in motion a chain of events that would change her existence in ways she could never have imagined. Carmen woke up with a sharp pain in her neck and back. Sleeping in the chair, even with blankets, had been torture. But when she opened her eyes and saw Rosa still sleeping in the bed, breathing peacefully, all the pain disappeared. She was alive. She was safe. Morning had arrived with an unnatural silence. Carmen got up slowly and looked out the window. The world was white, completely white. The snow had kept falling all night. Cars were buried, streets unrecognizable. Madrid was paralyzed. She made coffee, the aroma filling the small space. Rosa woke slowly, confused for a moment about where she was. Then the memories of the previous night returned, and she looked at Carmen with eyes full of emotion. They ate breakfast together. Carmen had little: bread, jam, coffee, but they shared it. They talked more. Rosa spoke of her life, the husband she had loved, the son who had disappointed her. Carmen talked about her unfulfilled dreams, the loneliness of the big city. Around noon, as they were figuring out what to do for lunch with Carmen's limited supplies, someone knocked on the door. A firm, insistent knock. Carmen got up, surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone and almost never had visitors. She looked through the peephole and caught her breath. Outside was a man around 40, in an impeccable dark Armani suit, a cashmere coat, and polished shoes that didn't belong in this rundown building. He was tall, distinguished, with dark hair just graying at the temples and a square jaw. Next to him were two other men, clearly bodyguards or assistants. Carmen opened the door slowly, confused and a little scared. The man looked at her with eyes that were a mix of relief, anxiety, and something else she couldn't identify. When he spoke, his voice was deep but charged with barely contained emotion. "My name is Javier Lopez. I'm looking for my mother, Rosa Lopez. I was told she might be here." Carmen stared at him, not understanding. Then, from behind her, came a trembling voice. Rosa had gotten up and appeared in the bathroom doorway. When she saw the man, her face transformed. First shock, then pain, then something complicated. The man saw her, and the tears he'd been holding back began to flow freely down his distinguished face. In a few steps, he was inside the studio, on his knees before his mother, taking her hands, his voice breaking. Carmen stood against the wall, a silent witness to a reunion clearly weighted with so much history. Rosa was crying, her hands on her son's face as if to make sure he was real. Javier kept repeating apologies, saying he had been a coward, that he had failed her. After several minutes, Javier stood up and turned to Carmen. He looked at her with an intensity that made her feel exposed. Then he did something completely unexpected. He took off his expensive coat, folded it carefully, and placed it on the chair. From the inside pocket of his jacket, he pulled out a checkbook. Carmen interrupted, her cheeks burning. She didn't want money. She had done what any decent person would have done. Javier looked at her with something like admiration mixed with disbelief. He explained quickly, he was a businessman, the owner of a chain of luxury hotels across Europe. He had lived in London for years building his empire. His father had died 15 years ago, leaving debts. Javier had worked like a madman to pay them off and build something. In the process, he had drifted away from his mother. At first out of necessity, working 20-hour days. Then out of shame, because he had success while she lived in poverty. He had sent money, yes, but never enough, and he had never visited, never called enough. It had become easier to avoid than to face. When he had finally called her the day before, after months of silence, he found the number disconnected. Worried, he had taken the first flight from London. He had arrived at her apartment to find it sealed. No neighbor knew where she was. He had spent the night searching for her, calling hospitals, police stations, shelters. At dawn, he had found a neighbor who had seen a young woman take her away during the storm. With the help of security cameras and a team of investigators, he had tracked her here. Carmen listened, overwhelmed. She looked at Rosa, who was looking at her son with eyes full of forgiveness and love despite all the pain. She looked at Javier, who clearly hated himself for what he had done. The dynamic was complicated, painful, but there was love there. wounded but real. Javier returned to his offer. It wasn't charity, he said. It was gratitude for saving the most important person in his life. It was respect for the kind of person Carmen was, someone who gave even when she had nothing to give. He wanted to help her, if she would allow it. Carmen hesitated. Her pride told her to refuse, but a small voice reminded her of her empty bank account, the rent coming due, the dreams abandoned because she couldn't afford to chase them. She looked at Rosa, who gave a small nod, her eyes saying, "It's okay. Accept." With a trembling voice, Carmen said she didn't want money like that. But if Javier was serious about helping, there was something she wished for. She wanted to start writing again, maybe go back to university for a master's degree. But most of all, she wanted Rosa to have a safe, warm place to live. If he could help with that, it would be enough. Javier looked at her with growing respect, then smiled, the first real smile since he'd entered. He promised he would take care of everything. Rosa would have the best apartment he could find, with assistance if she needed it. And for Carmen, he would pay for her education, whatever she wanted to study. Not as charity, but as an investment in a person who had shown the kind of character the world desperately needed. The following weeks were a whirlwind. Javier kept every promise. He found Rosa a beautiful, bright, warm apartment in the Salamanca district, with a kind caregiver. Rosa cried when she saw it, unable to believe that after so much struggle, she could end up somewhere so lovely. For Carmen, Javier paid for enrollment in a master's in creative writing at the Complutense University, plus a monthly stipend that allowed her to quit the restaurant and focus on her studies. Carmen protested, but Javier was firm. An unlikely friendship blossomed among the three of them. Carmen visited Rosa twice a week, bringing her sweets and telling her about her classes. Rosa became the grandmother Carmen had never had. And Javier, who at first only came to see his mother, began staying longer when Carmen was there. They talked about books, travel, dreams. Carmen discovered that behind the businessman was someone deeply lonely who had sacrificed relationships for success. Javier was fascinated by Carmen, not just for what she had done, but for who she was, intelligent, kind, with dreams that weren't about money but meaning. So different from the women in his world. Carmen found herself thinking about Javier more than she should. At first it was gratitude, she told herself. But then she noticed how her heart beat faster when he arrived, how she sought his gaze. It was crazy. He was a millionaire. She was an ex-waitress studying on his dime. Rosa watched it all with wise eyes. She saw how her son looked at Carmen, how she blushed. Two lonely souls too scared to admit their feelings. One night, she spoke to Carmen. "Love doesn't know class or money," she said. "If the feelings are real, you shouldn't deny them out of fear." But Javier had to return to London for 6 months. The night before he left, he organized a dinner on the panoramic terrace of his hotel overlooking the illuminated Gran Via. It was magical. Rosa retired early, leaving Javier and Carmen alone under the stars. The silence was charged. Carmen knew she had to say it now or never. With a trembling voice, she confessed she was in love with him. She knew it was crazy, that they were too different, but she couldn't let him go without telling the truth. Javier crossed the terrace, took her face in his hands, and kissed her with a desperate intensity. When they pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers and whispered that he loved her too, that he had fought the feelings for months but could no longer deny it. They kissed again, sweetly, promising to wait, to try, to see where this impossible, wonderful thing would take them. The next 6 months were difficult and beautiful. Javier was in London. They talked every day on video calls for hours. Carmen told him about her studies and the stories she was writing. Javier talked about work and his dreams for the future, a future he now imagined with her. But the distance weighed on them. Carmen would fall asleep crying, wondering if they were insane. Javier's world was so different. She lived modestly, he lived in penthouses and flew on private jets. Doubt came from the outside, too. Friends were skeptical. Online comments were cruel: modern Cinderella, gold digger. Rosa saw Carmen's torment and told her not to listen to the cynics. Love was rare and precious. When you found it, you had to hold on. Then came the crisis. After 4 months, Javier stopped responding. 2 days with no news. Carmen was frantic. When he finally called, he said they needed to talk. Carmen's heart sank. But Javier surprised her. He said everyone had been telling him he was making a mistake, that Carmen was wonderful but they came from worlds too different, that he needed to protect his assets. He had almost believed them. But then he had looked at photos of her, reread her messages, remembered how he felt with her, and realized he didn't care what anyone said. He wanted Carmen in his life forever. Carmen laughed through her tears and said yes, she loved him and couldn't wait. 2 months later, Javier returned to Madrid for good. He had restructured his business, delegated responsibilities, and opened a Madrid office. He wanted to be near his mother and Carmen. Their reunion was cinematic. Javier showed up one night at the university. When Carmen came out of class and saw him, she dropped her books and ran into his arms. They hugged as if they'd never let go. They began building a life together. Javier bought an apartment in Chueca, beautiful but not ostentatious. He introduced Carmen to his world: dinners with associates, charity events, openings. Carmen was terrified at first, but Javier never left her side, always proud of her. But not everyone was welcoming. One of Javier's business partners, Valentina, was particularly hostile. She had grown up in his world and had always assumed they would end up together. She was subtly cruel, making comments about how Carmen didn't belong. One night, after a particularly difficult event, Carmen broke down. She told Javier that maybe they were right. She didn't belong in his world. Sooner or later, he would realize it. Javier was firm. That world meant nothing without her. He could have all the money, but without love, it was empty. She made him better, happier, more human. And if his world wouldn't accept her, he would change his world. To prove it, Javier announced he would invest a significant part of his fortune in social projects in Madrid: shelters for the homeless, scholarships, neighborhood renovations. And he wanted Carmen to be part of it all. These weren't just words. Javier was putting his money where his values were, values he had learned from her. 2 years after that stormy night, Carmen stood in a beautiful garden in El Escorial. She wore a simple but elegant wedding dress. Before her, Javier looked at her with eyes full of love and wonder. Among the guests, Rosa sat in the front row, crying happy tears. The ceremony was intimate, just family and true friends. Carmen had insisted. She didn't want ostentation, she wanted meaning. When they exchanged vows, both spoke not only of love but of gratitude. Gratitude for the stormy night that had brought them together, gratitude for Rosa who had connected them, gratitude for every challenge that had made their love stronger. After the wedding, life settled into a wonderful new normal. Carmen finished her master's degree and published her first novel, a story inspired by her experience. It became a bestseller not because she was a millionaire's wife, but because it was genuinely good. The story of the waitress who took in a homeless woman and found love touched millions of hearts. Javier continued with his social projects. He opened a hotel entirely dedicated to providing jobs and training in hospitality for people in difficult situations. The project was so successful it was replicated in other cities. And Rosa lived to see it all. In her final years, surrounded by the love of her son and the daughter-in-law she loved as her own, she often said that the night of the storm had been both the worst and best night of her life. The worst because she had hit rock bottom. The best because she had discovered that kindness still existed in the world. When Rosa died peacefully in her sleep at 85, Javier and Carmen were by her side. Her last words were of gratitude. For the second chance life had given her, for the 4 happy years she'd had, for seeing her son finally happy. At the funeral, Carmen spoke of the woman who had changed her. She said Rosa had taught her that giving when you have nothing to give is the most precious gift of all. That kindness costs little but is worth everything. That love, in any form, is what makes life worth living. Years later, Javier and Carmen had 2 children, a boy and a girl. They raised them with the values that had been so important: humility, generosity, kindness. Every winter, at the first snowfall, they told their children the story of the night Grandma Rosa came into their lives during a storm. And every year, on the bench where Carmen had found Rosa, they placed flowers. A small plaque there reads simply, "Here began a miracle, where kindness met need and love was born from compassion." The little restaurant where Carmen had worked? Javier bought it and transformed it into a community kitchen where anyone who is hungry can eat for free. Above the door is a photo of a smiling Rosa. Carmen goes back often, sometimes to serve, sometimes just to remember. To remember the scared girl she once was, alone in a hostile big city. To remember the choice she made that night to be kind despite fear and uncertainty. To remember that choice changed not 1, but 3 lives. Because in the end, this story isn't really about a poor waitress who married a millionaire. It's not a Cinderella tale. It's something deeper. It's the story of how a single act of kindness can create ripples that touch lives in impossible to predict ways. It's the story of how a person's true worth isn't measured in money, but in character. It's the story of how real love can be born in the most unexpected places and survive the hardest challenges. And whenever anyone asks Carmen the secret to her happiness, she smiles and says the same thing. Choose kindness. Always. Even when it costs you. Especially when it costs you. Because you never know whose life you're saving. You never know what blessing you're inviting in. You never know when that choice to see the humanity in another person will change everything. The storm passed long ago. But what it brought, love, family, purpose, shines brighter than ever.